The heavy rain was turning the windshield into a blurred sheet of gray glass, making it nearly impossible to see more than 10 feet in front of my hood as I pushed deeper into the back roads of rural Arkansas. My GPS had been acting strangely for the last hour, the blue line flickering against a backdrop of empty green space, before it finally let out a digital chime and told me to turn left onto a road that didn't even have a name. I was already behind schedule for my move to Texas, my entire life packed into the trunk and back seat, which made me feel heavy and slow as I navigated the winding turns. Just as I began to wonder if I was truly lost, my headlights caught the reflection of a bright orange sign standing crookedly in the mud at the edge of the tree line. It wasn't a professional metal sign like you'd see on a highway, but a jagged piece of plywood with the words, "Bridge out." Follow arrows painted in thick, dripping black letters. Underneath the text, a crude arrow pointed toward a narrow gravel path that vanished into a dense thicket of pines and oaks. I hesitated for a moment, my engine idling with a low thrum that seemed to be the only sound in the world besides the rhythmic slapping of my wipers. Why hadn't the GPS warned me about a closed bridge? And why did the sign look like it had been painted in a hurry by someone with a shaking hand? I looked back at the main road, but the fog had rolled in so thick that the way I came was now a wall of white nothingness. With a sigh of frustration, I turned the wheel and followed the arrow, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires as the forest canopy closed over me like the ribs of a giant beast. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for my sedan, and the branches of the trees scraped against my windows with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. How far could this detour possibly go before it looped back to civilization? After about 3 miles of crawling through the dark, the gravel ended abruptly, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing that smelled of stagnant water and rotting wood. My headlights illuminated an old wooden bridge spanning a shallow creek, but as I got closer, I saw that the bridge wasn't out at all. It was blocked by a massive, rusted tractor parked sideways across the planks. I put the car in park, my heart starting to thrum against my ribs as I realized I was trapped between the tractor in front and the narrow, suffocating path behind me. I reached for my phone to check the map, but the signal bar was a hollow SOS, and the battery was draining at an alarming rate for no reason. That was when I noticed the first figure standing just outside the reach of my high beams, a tall, thin silhouette wearing a yellow rain slicker that looked unnaturally bright against the darkness of the woods. I stayed frozen in my seat, my breath fogging up the side window as I watched the figure raise a hand and point directly at my driver's side door. It wasn't a wave of greeting, but a command, and then I heard a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from the trunk of my car. It sounded like someone was tapping on the metal with a heavy ring, a slow and deliberate sound that made the hair on my neck stand straight up. How could someone be behind the car without me seeing them in the rearview mirror? I shifted into reverse, ready to floor it back into the woods, but my tires just spun in the fresh mud, kicking up a spray of brown slush that coated my back window. I was stuck, and the figure in the yellow slicker began to walk toward me with a slow, limping gait that suggested they had all the time in the world. "Hey, I just need to get through," I shouted through the glass, my voice sounding thin and terrified even to my own ears. The person didn't respond, but as they stepped into the light, I saw that they were wearing a porcelain doll mask, the painted rosy cheeks and wide blue eyes looking grotesque and frozen in the rain. Behind them, 2 more figures emerged from the trees, carrying long lengths of heavy iron chain that clinked softly as they dragged them through the wet grass. They weren't looking for money or my car. They were moving with the coordinated precision of people who had done this many times before. I realized then that the detour sign hadn't been a warning, but a lure, a way to filter travelers off the main road and into this private killing floor where no one would ever hear a scream over the sound of the rain. The man in the mask reached my window and leaned down, his face inches from the glass, and I could see his dark eyes moving behind the plastic slits as he examined me like a piece of livestock. He didn't try to break the glass immediately. Instead, he pulled a small, handheld radio from his pocket and spoke into it, his voice a low mumble that I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the headlights of the tractor on the bridge flickered to life, blinding me with a searing white light that filled the cabin of my car. I felt a massive jolt from behind as another vehicle, A heavy pickup truck I hadn't heard approach slammed into my rear bumper, pinning me firmly against the tractor. I was boxed in, a metal sandwich in the middle of nowhere, and the sound of a power drill began to whine near my door handle. They were trying to remove the lock mechanism entirely, working with a terrifyingly calm efficiency while I scrambled into the passenger seat, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy tire iron I had left on the floorboards after a flat tire a week ago, and I gripped the cold metal so hard my knuckles turned white. I knew that if they got the door open, I was finished, so I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged back into the driver's seat, threw the car into its lowest gear, and floored the accelerator while cutting the steering wheel hard to the right toward the steep embankment leading down to the creek. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but the car groaned and surged forward, the side of my vehicle scraping violently against the rusted tractor with a shower of sparks. The tires caught a patch of solid root, and the car launched forward, bouncing over the edge of the bridge and crashing into the shallow, muddy water below. The impact deployed the airbags with a deafening bang, filling the car with white dust and the smell of gunpowder. But I didn't wait for the fog to clear. I shoved my shoulder against the door, which was now partially submerged, and tumbled out into the freezing water of the creek. Above me, I could hear the men shouting, their flashlights cutting through the rain like searchlights as they realized their prize was escaping. I scrambled under the belly of the bridge, pressing my body into the cold, wet silt and holding my breath as the masked man walked directly above my head. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the icy water numbing my legs until I couldn't feel them anymore, listening to the sound of them searching the woods for my body. Eventually, the sound of the truck and the tractor faded away as they realized I must have been swept downstream or vanished into the dark. When the sun finally began to bleed a pale, sickly gray light through the clouds, I crawled out of the mud and began to hike in the opposite direction of the detour. I walked for 6 miles until I hit a paved road, flagged down a passing milk truck, and didn't stop shaking until I was sitting in a police station 2 counties away. My car was found a week later, completely stripped of every part and bleached clean of fingerprints, sitting in a field miles from where I had crashed it. I never go on road trips alone anymore, and every time I see an orange sign on the side of the road, I feel a cold shiver down my spine, wondering who really painted the arrows. The neon sign for the Sleepy Hollow Motel flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly green glow over the hood of my car as I pulled into the empty gravel lot. I had been driving for nearly 14 hours through the desolate stretches of the high plains, and the exhaustion was starting to manifest as strange shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. There wasn't another building for at least 50 miles in any direction, just the endless, flat horizon and the whistling wind that seemed to carry the scent of old dust and upcoming rain. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums, making me hesitate before opening the door. I just needed 6 hours of sleep and a cup of lukewarm coffee before I could finish the final leg of my journey to the coast. I stepped into the small wood-paneled lobby, a bell chiming weakly above the door to announce my arrival to the empty room. There was a thick sheet of plexiglass separating the counter from the hallway, and behind it sat a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment paper. Before I could even reach for my wallet or open my mouth to ask about the nightly rate, he reached under the counter and pulled out a brass key with a heavy plastic fob. "Welcome, Elias," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement, his eyes never leaving mine as he slid the key through the small gap in the glass. My blood turned to ice in my veins because I hadn't said a word, and I certainly hadn't shown him my ID or the reservation I hadn't even made yet. How did a man in the middle of a literal wasteland know the name of a stranger who had just pulled off the highway on a whim? "I think you have me confused with someone else," I stammered, my hand hovering over the key but refusing to touch it as a sense of deep wrongness filled my chest. The man didn't blink, his expression remaining as flat and lifeless as a mask, as he simply gestured toward the far end of the darkened parking lot. "Room 114 is already paid for, and the guest in 115 is expecting you to be quiet tonight, so please don't make any unnecessary noise." I wanted to turn around and run back to my car, But as I looked through the glass front door, I saw a white van pull into the lot and park directly behind my vehicle, blocking me in. 2 men stayed inside the van, their faces obscured by the glare of the flickering neon sign, but I could see the glow of their cigarettes as they watched the lobby door. I realized then that I wasn't just a guest. I was a delivery that had arrived exactly on schedule. I took the key, my fingers trembling so much that the metal clinked against the counter, and I walked out toward my room with my head down. Every instinct told me that the motel wasn't a place of rest, but a trap designed to funnel people into a space where they could be controlled and silenced. As I reached room 114, I noticed that the windows of all the other rooms were blacked out with heavy wooden boards, making the building look like a row of blind eyes. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place, but my heart sank when I saw that the door frame was splintered as if it had been kicked in and repaired dozens of times. I pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door, the wood groaning against the thin carpet, and then I turned my attention to the window. The window didn't have a latch. It was screwed shut from the outside with heavy steel brackets that glinted in the moonlight. I was in a cage, and the only way out was back through the door where the men in the white van were undoubtedly waiting for the lights to go out. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs squeaking loudly in the still air, and I realized that the walls were incredibly thin. From room 115, I could hear a low, rhythmic scratching sound, like someone was using a coin to scrape away the wallpaper inch by inch. Then came a whisper, so faint I had to press my ear against the cold drywall to hear it. A woman's voice saying, "Don't lay on the bed, Elias. The sensors are under the mattress." I jolted upright, looking at the lumpy floral bedspread with a new sense of horror as I realized how coordinated this operation truly was. They weren't just watching me. They were measuring my movements, waiting for the moment my heart rate slowed and I fell into a deep, vulnerable sleep. I heard the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel outside, moving slowly toward my door, followed by the faint metallic jingle of a master key being inserted into the lock. The dresser I had moved was the only thing standing between me and whatever was waiting in the dark, and I could see the door handle turning slowly, back and forth, as someone tested the strength of the barricade. "Elias," a voice whispered from the other side of the wood. "We know you're awake, and it's much easier for everyone if you just cooperate." I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the heavy glass lamp from the nightstand and smashed the bulb against the floor, using the jagged base as a desperate weapon. I knew I couldn't go out the door, so I looked up at the ceiling and saw a small, rectangular access hatch for the attic crawl space. I climbed onto the dresser, my muscles screaming with tension, and pushed the hatch upward, feeling a rush of stale, hot air hit my face. I hauled myself up into the darkness just as the door to the room was forced open with a violent crack of wood, the dresser being shoved aside by the sheer strength of the men outside. From my vantage point in the rafters, I looked down through the open hatch and saw 3 men enter the room, one of them holding a heavy roll of duct tape and a syringe. They moved with a terrifying lack of emotion, checking the bathroom and looking under the bed, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the floorboards. "He's in the ceiling," one of them shouted, and I didn't wait to hear the rest as I began to crawl frantically across the wooden joists toward the end of the building. The crawl space was filled with old insulation and the skeletons of birds, but I kept moving until I reached the vent at the very end of the motel row. I kicked the plastic grating out with all my might and tumbled onto the roof, the cold night air hitting my lungs like a shock of electricity. I could see the men running out of my room below, looking around the parking lot with flashlights that cut through the darkness like blades. I slid down the back of the motel, my skin tearing against the rough shingles, and landed in the tall, dry grass that bordered the property. I didn't head for my car. I knew they would be watching the lot, so I ran straight into the darkness of the open plains, moving toward the distant, flickering lights of a cell tower I had seen miles back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, never looking back even when I heard the sound of engines revving in the distance. I spent the rest of the night hiding in a concrete culvert under the highway, watching the white van cruise slowly up and down the road, its headlights searching the ditches for any sign of movement. When the sun finally rose, A highway patrol officer spotted me walking along the shoulder, covered in mud and insulation. And I have never been more grateful to see a badge in my entire life. They never found the men or the manager. By the time the police raided the Sleepy Hollow Motel, the building was empty, the sign was dark, and every file in the office had been burned to ash in a metal trash can. I woke up in the driver's seat of my car at a dusty gas station in the middle of the Nebraska plains, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the heat or the silence, but the small, bright blue child's backpack sitting perfectly upright in my passenger seat. I live alone, I have no children, and I hadn't opened my passenger door for the last 300 miles of my cross-country move. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I looked at the zippers, which were slightly open, revealing a glimpse of a tattered teddy bear and a handwritten note tucked into the side pocket. How could someone have opened my car, placed this inside, and vanished without me waking up from my 20-minute nap? I looked around the gas station, but the pumps were rusted, the windows of the convenience store were boarded up, and there wasn't a single other soul in sight for miles. I grabbed the backpack and threw it out onto the pavement, gasping for air as I slammed the car into drive and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust behind me. The sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the sky into a deep, bruised shade of orange, and I felt a growing sense of dread that I was being watched from the endless rows of corn that lined the highway. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I felt like I saw a flicker of movement in the back seat, a shadow that didn't belong to the boxes of my clothes or my kitchen supplies. Why would someone leave a child's item in a stranger's car at a dead gas station? Was it a marker, or was it a warning of something far worse that had already been set in motion? As the light faded completely, my headlights caught a glint of metal on the road ahead, and I realized with a jolt of terror that someone had laid a strip of spiked chains across the asphalt. I swerved hard, my tires screaming as I barely avoided the trap, but my car skidded into the soft dirt of the shoulder and came to a bone-jarring halt. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling roughly, my eyes searching the darkness for the people who had laid that trap. Then, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number, and when I looked at the screen, my blood turned to liquid ice. It was a photo of me, taken from the back seat of my own car while I was sleeping at the gas station, and the caption simply read, "You forgot your bag." I realized with a sickening thud in my stomach that the person who put the backpack in my car hadn't left. They were still out there, somewhere in the blackness of the cornfield, watching me struggle to get my car back onto the road. I shifted the car into reverse, but the wheels just spun in the loose soil, digging me deeper into the ground while the tall corn stalks swayed in the wind like 1,000 skeletal hands. A pair of high beams suddenly ignited in the field behind me, cutting through the stalks and illuminating the interior of my car with a blinding artificial glare. It was a heavy-duty farm truck, and it was moving toward me with a slow, deliberate pace that told me they knew I was trapped. I scrambled into the back of my car, digging through my moving boxes until my hands closed around the heavy metal handle of a tire iron. I knew I couldn't outrun them on foot in the dark, and I couldn't get the car out of the ditch in time, so I had to find a way to make them think I was gone. I turned off all my lights, crawled into the very back of the trunk space, and covered myself with a thick moving blanket, praying that the darkness would be my only ally. Through the thin fabric, I heard the heavy truck pull up alongside my car and the sound of heavy boots hitting the gravel of the shoulder. There was a long silence, broken only by the wind, and then I heard the sound of my driver's side door being forced open with a crowbar. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, listening as someone climbed into the front seat and began rummaging through my belongings. "He's not here?" a rough voice whispered, sounding uncomfortably close to my ear. But he couldn't have gone far on foot in this terrain. I heard them exit the car and walk toward the cornfield, their flashlights dancing across the blanket that covered me, but they didn't think to look in the cramped space of the trunk. I waited until the sound of their footsteps faded into the rustling of the corn, and then I moved with a desperate speed I didn't know I possessed. I crawled back into the driver's seat, grabbed a heavy wooden plank I had seen near the ditch, and jammed it under my front tire to give it some traction. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years as I turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a defiant growl. I floored the accelerator, the car bucking and shaking as the tires finally caught the wood and propelled me back onto the solid asphalt of the highway. I didn't turn on my headlights until I was a mile away, terrified that the light would give away my position to the truck in the field. I drove for 30 minutes in the dim moonlight, my eyes wide and searching for any sign of pursuit, until I finally saw the glowing sign of a 24-hour truck stop. I pulled in right next to a group of truckers who were standing outside their rigs, and I didn't stop shaking until I had told the manager to call the state police. When the officers arrived and searched my car, they found something that made the hair on my neck stand up for the rest of my life. Tucked deep inside the upholstery of the passenger seat, right where the backpack had been sitting, was a small GPS tracking device that had been broadcasting my exact location for the last 5 hours. The backpack hadn't been a gift or a prank. It was a way to ensure I stayed still long enough for them to plant the tracker and prepare the ambush further down the road. I never found out who those people were, but I spent the next 3 nights in a well-lit hotel with the door bolted, and I never, ever sleep in my car anymore.